A millionaire left his wife for a younger, captivating woman, convinced he was finally living the dream. But behind her smile hid a secret life, layers of deceit, manipulation, and crime. As his world collapsed piece by piece, the truth emerged. The woman he trusted most wasn't his salvation, she was his downfall. The sun dipped below the hills of Milford Heights, casting golden streaks across the manicured lawns and cobblestone streets that lined the gated neighborhood. At the far end of the private cul-de-sac stood an architectural masterpiece of modern indulgence. Black steel, white stone, glass panels 3 stories high. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with energy, laughter, and the sound of a jazz trio echoing beneath vaulted ceilings. Chandeliers flickered like crystal stars over guests dressed in designer labels and sipping champagne that cost more than most people's rent. Colton Reeves, the man of the hour, stood in the center of it all, greeting each guest with the kind of smile you couldn't buy but could certainly learn when you were used to being the richest man in every room. His dark navy suit hugged his tall frame flawlessly, a custom-tailored fit from a Milanese designer whose name most people only saw in magazines. He moved with calculated charm, offering practiced compliments, laughing at just the right volume, his eyes constantly scanning the crowd for admiration. This wasn't just a party. This was a declaration, a public unveiling of his new life, a rebirth sculpted by freedom, youth, and power. At his side was Brielle, 26, captivating, enigmatic. Her honey-toned skin glowed under the dim lights, and her long black hair flowed down her back like silk. She wore a red satin dress that clung to her curves with unapologetic elegance, her presence commanding attention even from those too polite to stare openly. The way she touched Colton's arm, the way she leaned into his shoulder and whispered jokes that made him laugh too loud, it all played like a performance for the watching eyes. But for Colton, it was real. He'd convinced himself of it. After all, hadn't he earned the right to start over? To trade in years of domestic routine for something thrilling, electric, unforgettable? It hadn't been long since he signed the final divorce papers. 20 years of marriage with Dana, gone in an ink stroke. The headlines were clean, the settlement quieter than expected. Dana had chosen discretion over drama, dignity over destruction. She didn't attend the party. Of course not. Why would she want to see the man she built a life with parade around with a woman barely older than their daughter? Still, for Colton, there was no remorse, only relief. He was done with comfort. He craved something wild, something untamed. And Brielle? Brielle was everything Dana was not. "What do you think?" Brielle asked, her voice a soft melody in his ear as they stood at the glass balcony overlooking the city skyline. "This life, it suits you." He grinned, brushing his hand across her lower back. "You suit me." She turned to face him, her eyes bright but unreadable. "Then let's make it unforgettable." Downstairs, guests continued to toast, but not everyone raised their glasses with genuine cheer. Some smiled politely, masking whispers behind jeweled fingers. "I give it 6 months," muttered a woman in a pearl-studded gown. "You're being generous," replied her husband. At the far edge of the room, Nathaniel Brooks, Colton's longtime attorney and reluctant confidant, watched silently. He wasn't the type to speak out of turn, but something in his eyes said he wasn't entirely convinced this new chapter was as glamorous as it appeared. Later that night, after the last bottle was popped and the final guest had wandered out with party favors and stories to tell, Colton leaned back in his leather armchair in the study, a drink in one hand and a satisfied smirk on his face. Brielle was upstairs, probably already in the spa, soaking in lavender and champagne bubbles. He thought about joining her, but first, he wanted a moment to savor it alone. The silence, the solitude, the feeling of having done what most men only dreamed about, breaking free, starting again, reclaiming youth. He didn't hear the phone vibrate at first. When he glanced over, a message flashed on the screen, an unknown number, one he didn't recognize. "She's not who you think she is." His brow furrowed. He stared at it for a few seconds, unsure whether to laugh or feel unsettled. He deleted it and dismissed it as a prank. His success attracted attention, some admiration, some envy. It wasn't unusual for people to try to rattle his peace. Upstairs, Brielle stood in front of the mirror, removing her earrings one by one, her expression suddenly void of the warmth she'd shown all evening. Her phone buzzed again. and she turned it over quickly to read the message. "He's all yours now. Don't forget why you're there." She didn't respond. The following morning, the house staff returned to find remnants of the celebration scattered like confetti through the halls. Colton was already in the breakfast nook, reading stock reports and sipping espresso. Brielle appeared soon after, glowing and radiant, greeting the staff with a smile so perfect it almost seemed rehearsed. "I think we should redo the living room," she said casually, placing her hand on his shoulder. "The living room?" He raised an eyebrow. "It doesn't feel like us," she replied, walking toward the bay window and looking out. "I want something warmer. Softer." Colton chuckled. "You've been here 2 nights. I just want to make it feel like home," she said over her shoulder. "Our home." He watched her for a moment. She was beautiful, magnetic, and she made him feel alive again. If she wanted to redesign the entire house, so be it. He had the money. Let her shape it. Let her touch everything. "Whatever you want," he said. But deep down, something felt too fast, too smooth, too perfectly timed. Later that week, Dana sat alone in a modest but elegant apartment downtown, sipping tea and flipping through a newspaper. The headline caught her eye. "Colton Reeves. New love, new life." She read it with an expression that was neither bitter nor sad, just quiet, reflective. There was a photo of Colton and Brielle, arms wrapped around each other like a magazine cover. She folded the page and set it aside. Then she reached into her drawer and pulled out an old leather folder. Inside it were documents, copies, names, addresses, things she hadn't needed to look at for years. But now maybe it was time. She stared at one of the documents for a long moment. Then, without a word, she picked up her phone and made a call. "Hi, it's Dana Reeves. I need a favor." Back at the mansion, Colton walked into his office to find Brielle standing near his desk, a file in her hand. "Didn't mean to snoop," she said, smiling innocently. "Just saw this and got curious." He laughed, brushing it off. "Feel free. There's nothing I wouldn't show you." She leaned in and kissed him lightly on the cheek. "That's what I love about you." And just like that, she walked out of the room, leaving the file exactly where she found it, but not before slipping a small USB drive into her purse. Colton didn't see it. He wouldn't, not yet. But the story was already unfolding, and not in the way he thought. Before we jump into the next part, I want to hear from you. What would you do if the person you loved turned your life upside down? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Give this story a rating from 0 to 10, and don't forget to like and subscribe. It only gets better from here. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting soft light over the polished marble floors of the Reeves estate. Outside, the fountain in the circular driveway danced with rhythm, a tranquil contrast to the storm quietly brewing within the walls of the house. Colton stood in front of the mirror adjusting his cufflinks, admiring the fit of his tailored suit. It had been 2 weeks since the celebration that marked his new life, and every morning since, he had woken up with a sense of renewed purpose. Everything felt different now, lighter, more exciting. The air even seemed fresher. The weight of familiarity, of expectation, of routine was gone. In its place was something thrilling, something untamed. And much of it came from the woman now seated across from him at the breakfast table, barefoot, wrapped in a silk robe, sipping espresso with that same glint of mischief in her eyes. Brielle twirled a spoon between her fingers, watching him silently. "Are you really going to the office today?" she asked, voice low and smooth. "I can't exactly run an empire from bed," he replied, buttoning his jacket. "Why not? You built it already," she said, leaning back in her chair. "What's left to prove?" He chuckled and reached for his keys. "Growth never sleeps, darling. I've got meetings all day. We're expanding the Brazil project." Brielle stood slowly and walked to him, arms snaking around his neck. "Let the project wait," she whispered, placing a kiss on his jaw. "Stay? Let's drive out to the coast, have lunch by the water. You deserve it." Colton paused for a second, tempted. Her pull was undeniable, but ambition still tugged at him harder. "Soon," he promised. "There's too much on my plate today." Brielle stepped back with a playful sigh. "You're no fun." "I'm rich," he grinned. "Fun comes later." He left the house feeling satisfied, unaware that behind him, Brielle stood at the window, watching his car disappear down the road with a look far less playful than before. Her fingers grazed the edge of the glass as her smile faded into stillness. Then she turned and walked back through the hallway, her eyes scanning the walls and furniture like she was mentally cataloging everything she intended to change. By noon, 2 interior designers were walking through the house with her, notepads in hand, nodding as she spoke confidently about replacing the artwork, changing the flooring in the master bedroom, and installing a new wine cellar. The house staff followed behind quietly, trying not to show the confusion on their faces. Mrs. Dana had never done things this way. She had always consulted them, involved them, treated them like more than service. But this new woman, this replacement, was different. She gave orders, not suggestions. Her eyes lingered too long on valuable items. Her voice had an edge wrapped in sugar. And within a few days, 3 of the long-term staff had quietly resigned. "Is there something wrong with the silver cutlery?" asked Miriam, the head housekeeper, cautiously. "No," Brielle said, flipping through fabric samples. "It's just outdated. We'll replace it all. Find something more elegant." Miriam hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Mr. Reeves and Mrs. Dana had that set custom-made in Italy after their wedding. It was. Brielle didn't even look up. Well, now there's no Mrs. Dana. The silence that followed was thick. No one said another word. That evening, when Colton returned home, the first thing he noticed was the change in the foyer. The classic portrait of the Reeves family, painted years ago, was gone. In its place was a large abstract canvas, all sharp lines and deep red swirls. He frowned, puzzled. "Where's the painting?" "Oh," Brielle said, descending the staircase in a flowing cream dress. "I had it removed. It felt stale. That painting's been there for 10 years. And it's been boring for 10 years, she replied casually. "Don't worry, it's in storage. I didn't throw it away." Colton tried to suppress his annoyance, but a flicker of discomfort settled in his chest. "Maybe talk to me before making decisions like that." "You're right," she said, stepping closer. "I just wanted to surprise you. I'll consult you next time." He nodded slowly, letting it go. Maybe she was just trying to make the place feel like hers. It wasn't a big deal. Yet, that night, Brielle prepared a lavish dinner for 2. Candles, jazz, her perfume subtly filling the air. The food was exquisite, the wine even better. But Colton couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting. It wasn't about the painting or the cutlery. It was the way the house felt now. Like it wasn't his anymore. Like it had become a stage for someone else's play. He tried to dismiss it. Maybe he just needed time to adjust. After all, he'd chosen this. He'd wanted this. And Brielle, with her infectious energy and radiant beauty, was everything he thought he needed. She brought color into his world. But now that color seemed to be bleeding into places it didn't belong. The next day, his assistant called him in a panic. "Mr. Reeves, we need your approval on the contract renewals for the regional offices. We've been waiting for your review." "I told you I'd handle it today," Colton snapped, realizing he'd forgotten. For the first time in months, he felt scattered, unfocused. He couldn't remember the last time he'd missed a deadline. Back at the mansion, Brielle sat on the patio scrolling through her phone. A message popped up from an unknown contact. "Phase 1 complete. You're doing great. Stay close to him. Keep him distracted." She stared at the message for a few seconds, then deleted it and slid the phone into her pocket. Colton returned late that night, exhausted and irritable. He found Brielle asleep on the couch, a glass of wine half empty beside her. She looked so peaceful, so innocent. He knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Maybe he was imagining things. Maybe he just wasn't used to change. He kissed her forehead and whispered, "You're my peace." But in her sleep, Brielle stirred slightly, and for a brief moment, her expression hardened, like a shadow had passed over her face. The following morning, Colton received another anonymous message. This one came with a photo, blurry, but clear enough. It showed Brielle in a coffee shop, sitting across from a man he didn't recognize. The two appeared deep in conversation, heads close together. There was no context, no caption, just the image. Colton stared at it for a long time. He considered confronting her, but hesitated. What would he even say? What if it was nothing? What if he pushed too hard and ruined something good? He closed the message and told himself it didn't matter. But the seed had been planted, and Brielle had already begun replacing more than furniture. The days blurred into weeks, and the mansion that once held the rhythm of Colton Reeves' precise routines had now transformed into something unfamiliar. The hallways no longer echoed with structure and order, but with laughter that didn't belong to him, the clatter of changes he hadn't approved, and the strange sensation that nothing truly belonged to him anymore, not even the silence. From the outside, everything still looked perfect. Colton still pulled into his circular driveway in one of his luxury sedans. He still walked through the grand entryway wearing $1,000 suits and still answered calls from investors who regarded him as a titan. But on the inside, something was slipping. Something subtle, something he couldn't quite explain, like a thread being quietly pulled from the edge of a carefully woven tapestry. It started with the small things: an error in a financial report, an investment that didn't yield the expected return, a miscommunication with a key client that nearly cost a contract. Colton had always prided himself on his sharpness, his ability to stay 5 steps ahead, but lately, he felt off balance. He would lose his train of thought during meetings, forget where he placed important files, even struggle to recall conversations he'd had earlier that day. He blamed it on stress, on transition, on the natural toll of maintaining an empire. But a whisper in the back of his mind asked a different question. What if it wasn't just him? At first, he resisted the thought. But the whispers grew louder when he found discrepancies in the accounting logs. Small amounts withdrawn from joint accounts, listed under generic labels like interior consulting or miscellaneous services. He asked Brielle casually one night over dinner if she'd hired any new vendors. She smiled and nodded, mentioned a local art consultant and a holistic space designer, someone named Lenny, who specialized in energy flow. Energy flow? Colton asked, raising an eyebrow. You wouldn't understand, she said with a soft laugh. It's all about creating harmony in the space. Right? He muttered, trying to let it go, but his instincts wouldn't. One day, as he returned early from a canceled meeting, he found Brielle in his study, his private study, standing in front of his bookshelf with one of his old portfolios open. She didn't hear him approach until he cleared his throat. She turned quickly, smiling, completely unbothered. I was looking for design inspiration, she said smoothly, holding the leather-bound portfolio in her hands. You have such a fascinating aesthetic. Colton stepped inside, eyes narrowing. That's from my investment archives. Oh, she said, setting it down gently. Sorry, I didn't realize it was sensitive. It's not sensitive, he replied slowly, picking up the folder and inspecting it. It's just not for decoration. She tilted her head, playful. You're cute when you're serious. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He waited until she left the room before checking the folder again. 2 of the reports inside were in a different order than he remembered, and one document was missing, a risk assessment draft he'd compiled months ago for a potential merger. Nothing earth-shattering, but it was strange. He checked his drawers. Nothing missing. Maybe he was overthinking. That night, Brielle wore a new silk gown he hadn't seen before. When he complimented her on it, she smiled and said it had been a small splurge. But later, when he reviewed the joint account out of curiosity, he found a charge to an exclusive boutique in Manhattan. Several $1,000s. Far more than a small splurge. He didn't confront her. Not yet. He wanted to believe this was a phase, a whirlwind adjustment period, a small price to pay for the kind of love he had convinced himself he needed. Still, something about her behavior unsettled him. Then there were the guests. They began appearing at odd times. People Brielle claimed were old friends, former colleagues, design consultants, energy readers. Colton would find unfamiliar faces lounging in the sunroom, sipping cocktails, flipping through business magazines like they belonged there. One man in particular, tall, lean, with a sharp jawline and a smirk that never left his face, stood out. His name was Cyrus. Brielle introduced him as a spiritual wellness advisor. But Cyrus asked too many questions, lingered too long in Colton's office when he thought no one was watching, and once even commented on Colton's stock portfolio like he knew the inside workings. Funny, Cyrus said one evening during a small gathering. I've heard this firm is looking shaky lately. You must be feeling the pressure. Colton's eyes sharpened. I wasn't aware you followed the market. I follow energy, Cyrus replied smoothly, raising his glass. And yours feels cluttered. Later that night, Colton couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling while Brielle slept beside him, her breathing soft and even. He turned and looked at her, watched the way she curled into the pillows, her face so serene. She had become so entwined in his life so quickly, too quickly, and yet he couldn't explain it, couldn't define exactly what felt wrong. He only knew that the house felt different when she wasn't in it, but not in a good way. In a way that made him question his own space, his own identity. He missed the quiet stability that Dana once provided, even if he didn't want to admit it. He reached for his phone and, on impulse, called Nathaniel, his lawyer. "It's probably nothing," Colton said after explaining the strange transactions and missing document. "I just want you to run a background check on someone." Nathaniel didn't sound surprised. "Who?" "Brielle." There was a long pause. "You want me to dig into your girlfriend?" "I want to know if there's anything I should be worried about," Colton said flatly. "I'll handle it." He ended the call and looked at the city beyond the glass walls. Somewhere out there was the truth, and he was suddenly unsure if he was prepared to find it. The next day, his assistant called again. Another contract had been mishandled. Another investor was pulling out. Colton snapped at his team, demanded answers, berated them in a way he hadn't done in years. Something was unraveling. And then, hours later, Nathaniel called him back. "I've got something you need to see," he said. "Not over the phone. Meet me tomorrow." That night, Brielle prepared his favorite dinner. Pasta and white truffle sauce, a meal she'd only made once before, early in their relationship. Colton sat at the table watching her, trying to read the emotions beneath her movements, wondering if she could feel the suspicion radiating from him. "You're quiet tonight," she said. "Long day. Everything all right?" He nodded, forcing a smile. "Just business." "You should let it go," she said softly, reaching across the table and touching his hand. "You have everything you could possibly want now. Stop chasing problems." Her words were soothing, but his mind was already elsewhere. Later, alone in his office, he reviewed the joint account again. More withdrawals. Transfers to unfamiliar accounts. One marked simply as Wellness Initiative Fund. He stared at it for a long time. Then, from the top drawer, he pulled out a small folder Dana had left behind after she moved out, an old emergency contact list and financial tracking logs she used to maintain. He flipped through them slowly. One page caught his eye, an old advisory memo from Dana that he had ignored at the time, about keeping financial holdings separated and asset protections in place. He'd never followed through. In the hallway, Brielle walked quietly past the study door, pausing just long enough to glance at him through the crack. He didn't notice her watching. She walked back to their bedroom, her lips curved into a knowing smile. The morning began like most others, quiet, polished, predictable. The sun rose behind the hills, casting golden streaks across the vast manicured lawns, and the sprinklers flicked on like clockwork, misting the hydrangeas lining the driveway. The staff moved through the house silently, their footsteps muffled by thick Persian rugs. In the kitchen, breakfast was being prepared with mechanical precision, but there was something brittle in the air, something almost imperceptible, like a warning whispered between the walls. Colton sat in his study, poring over the reports that Nathaniel had delivered the night before. They were neatly bound, discreetly labeled, and devastatingly thorough. Every page told a different story about the woman he'd so proudly brought into his life. Brielle had more names than he could count, scattered across bank accounts and past residencies. A string of aliases traced through several states, mostly under the radar, each identity slightly modified from the last, none of them completely clean. And the people she'd associated with, at least two were connected to high-profile financial scams. The most recent was Cyrus, not a wellness advisor at all, but a known associate of a con network operating in Europe and South America. Colton had stared at that detail for a long time. He remembered the way Cyrus had looked at his stock reports, the way he spoke with veiled familiarity about the company's vulnerabilities. His hands trembled slightly as he flipped through the last few pages. It couldn't be a coincidence, but he didn't know what to do next. Fire Brielle? Confront her? Call the police? And then what? Admit to the world that he'd been duped, humiliated, played like a fool by a woman half his age? No, he wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Pride held him back like chains. He needed more proof. Proof that would absolve him, clear his name, let him take control of the story before it swallowed him. At noon, the front gate intercom buzzed. Miriam, the housekeeper, answered from the kitchen panel. A man stood outside, mid-40s, tall, dressed plainly in jeans and a worn leather jacket. He had a small duffel bag slung over his shoulder and a tired look in his eyes. "I'm here to see Brielle," he said into the camera. Miriam's brows knit together. "I'm sorry, sir. Who should I say is calling?" Just tell her it's Liam. She hesitated before paging Colton. He arrived moments later, irritated, his mind still reeling from the report in his hands. There's a man at the gate, Miriam said. Claims he knows Ms. Brielle. Says his name is Liam. Colton's stomach dropped. Did she say anything about him? No, sir. Should I tell him to leave? No, Colton said after a moment. Let him in. He waited in the foyer as the gates swung open. Liam approached the front door slowly, cautiously, like a man walking into enemy territory. When the door opened, their eyes locked for a second. Colton didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence was heavy enough. I'm not here to cause problems, Liam said first. I just need to talk to her. Who are you? Colton asked. I told your staff. Liam. I meant, who are you to her? Liam hesitated. We go way back. Colton narrowed his eyes. You're going to have to do better than that. Liam ran a hand through his hair. I don't want to say more out here. Just tell her I'm here. Colton didn't move. She's not home. Liam studied him carefully. Then I'll wait. You're not going to sit around my house like a guest while I figure out whether you're another one of her consultants. Liam smirked slightly. You're smarter than I thought. That's when Brielle walked in, heels clicking against the marble floor, a shopping bag in one hand and sunglasses in the other. She stopped mid-step when she saw Liam standing inside the doorway, the color draining from her face in an instant. Liam, she said, her voice barely audible. Hello, sweetheart, he replied with a cool edge. What are you doing here? Her tone shifted quickly from surprise to unease. Colton turned to her sharply. So, you do know him. She stepped forward slowly. He's someone I used to work with. From before. Liam chuckled. Work is a funny word. Colton's jaw clenched. What kind of work? Brielle shot Liam a look, a warning. He's exaggerating. Liam shrugged. Does he know about Caracas? Or Milan? Or should I leave those parts out? I think it's time you left, Brielle snapped. I think it's time he knew what he's living with, Liam replied, his voice rising slightly. I said get out, she yelled. Colton stepped between them. Enough. Liam, whatever game this is, I'm not playing. You need to leave. Liam looked him in the eyes one last time. You'll figure it out eventually, he said quietly. She always leaves a trail. Then he turned and walked out, leaving silence in his wake. Brielle stood frozen for a moment, then turned to Colton, her expression shifting quickly into something softer. He's just a bitter man, she said. We worked on a business project years ago. It fell apart. He lost money. He's been following me around ever since. Colton didn't say anything. He walked back to his study, closed the door, and sat down heavily in his chair. He didn't believe her. Not anymore. But he wasn't ready to confront her either. Not until he had more leverage. He picked up his phone and called Nathaniel again. I need you to dig deeper, he said. I want to know everything. That night, Brielle acted like nothing had happened. She poured them wine, cooked a beautiful dinner, danced barefoot in the living room like a woman without a care in the world. But Colton couldn't enjoy any of it. His mind kept going back to Liam's words, Caracas, Milan. The way Brielle's face had changed when she saw him. The way she'd lied so easily afterward. Later, when she fell asleep beside him, he stared at the ceiling in silence. He turned his head slowly to look at her sleeping face. She looked peaceful again, but he knew now it was a mask. He reached over and unlocked her phone quietly, scrolling through her messages. Most were benign, but one caught his attention. It was a message from an unknown number. We warned you not to get personal. Finish what you came for. Quickly, he stared at it for a long time before locking the phone again and setting it back on the nightstand. Then he lay down beside her and closed his eyes. But sleep never came. The days that followed Liam's visit were soaked in a strange tension, thick and lingering, like fog that refused to lift. Colton went about his usual routine, but everything had taken on a different tone. His morning coffee tasted bitter, his meetings felt rushed, and even his nightly walks through the gardens, once his favorite ritual, now felt like slow descents into unease. He watched Brielle more closely now. Every glance, every phone call, every half-smile she gave when she thought he wasn't looking. He scrutinized it all, yet found no clear answers. She was clever, too clever. And Colton, for the first time in years, didn't feel like the most intelligent person in his own home. But if Brielle noticed his growing distance, she didn't show it. On the surface, she remained her usual self, charming, affectionate, intoxicating in her presence. But behind her smile, Colton began to notice a quiet assertiveness growing stronger each day, as though she were slowly tightening a grip he hadn't realized she had on him. He'd catch her handling administrative documents, giving directions to the house staff without consulting him, reorganizing the office in his absence. Once, he returned from a meeting to find her on a video call with his financial advisor, laughing lightly as she discussed investment options as if she were the client. When he confronted her about it, she simply shrugged and said she was helping out while he was too busy. "You were always complaining about how much time it takes," she said, stretching her arms behind her head, casually lounging on his office chair. "I thought I'd make things easier." "You don't make financial decisions in this house," he said firmly. "I didn't make any decisions," she said, tilting her head. "I ask questions. Isn't that what partners do?" He wanted to yell, to shout that she wasn't his partner, that she wasn't even close to being his equal in business, but something in her expression stopped him. A glint in her eyes, barely perceptible, warned him not to push. So he let it go. Again. And slowly, he began to feel more and more like a guest in his own empire. Things at work weren't much better. His assistant had resigned suddenly, citing a change in life direction. 2 other key team members followed suit within days. The turnover destabilized his project schedules, and for the first time in years, deadlines were missed. Reports piled up on his desk, unanswered calls grew more frequent, and potential clients stopped returning emails without explanation. Colton assumed it was coincidence. A bad quarter. Bad timing. But part of him couldn't help wondering if it wasn't just the business falling apart. If somehow, in some invisible way, Brielle was the epicenter of all of it. One morning, he discovered a new email chain between Brielle and a name he didn't recognize, Julian Hart. The messages were encrypted and protected by an unfamiliar password folder, hidden beneath layers of unrelated files in their shared system. When he finally managed to open them using a decryption tool provided by Nathaniel, what he found sent a chill down his spine. The messages were vague but suggestive, discussions of targets, phases, and liquidation windows. One message stood out. Phase 2 begins when the isolation is complete. He'll push everyone away on his own. That's the pattern. Colton closed the laptop slowly, sitting in silence. He tried to piece it all together, the staff leaving, the mishandled projects, the financial slippage, his own disorientation. Was it orchestrated? Was he being manipulated into dependency, into solitude? He couldn't be sure, but he felt it, like vines growing around him, slowly cutting him off from everything he once had control over. He began working from home more, hoping it would help him keep a tighter grip on things. But being home meant being closer to her, and Brielle used every moment to insert herself deeper. She was always around, offering help, sharing articles, suggesting changes to his workflow. At first, it was subtle. Then it became invasive. She replaced his office chair with one she claimed would help his posture. She swapped out his filing system for a digital version she managed. His personal contacts began receiving emails he never wrote. When he asked about it, she insisted he must have forgotten sending them. "You've been under a lot of stress," she said, pouring him tea. "Maybe you just need rest." "Don't patronize me," he snapped. "I'm not," she replied calmly. "I'm just worried about you." The worst part was, part of him started to believe her. He began second-guessing himself, questioning his memory, wondering if he was overreacting. Maybe he was too suspicious. Maybe it was the pressure. Maybe he was just aging, faltering. He didn't like the version of himself he was becoming. Paranoid, anxious, withdrawn. But the deeper he sank into that hole, the more Brielle tightened her hold. She arranged his schedule, canceled meetings she deemed unimportant, intercepted calls, and even suggested hiring a personal assistant who would report to her instead of his firm. When he refused, she pouted. "I'm just trying to help. I thought we were building something together." "We're not," he said firmly. "This is my company, Brielle, not yours." "But I'm in your life," she said, voice dropping slightly. "Isn't that the same thing?" He stared at her, unable to respond. That night, he took a long drive, desperate for space. He ended up in front of a quiet restaurant on the east side of town, one he hadn't been to in years. And there, as if fate had placed her in his path, was Dana, sitting at an outdoor table with a colleague, laughing over a glass of wine. She looked different, lighter, freer, as though she'd shed the weight he never realized he'd placed on her shoulders. She saw him, and their eyes met for a brief moment. She offered a small, polite nod and returned to her conversation. He didn't approach. He didn't even wave. He just stood there for a minute, feeling something he couldn't name. Back at home, Brielle was waiting for him on the balcony, wrapped in a blanket, sipping wine. She greeted him with a kiss, acting as if nothing had changed, as if she hadn't been slowly dismantling the world he'd built from the inside out. That night, he dreamed of falling, not from a height, but from a place of power, of certainty. He was tumbling, weightless, helpless, and there was no one there to catch him. Not his staff, not his friends, not even Dana. Just Brielle, watching from above, smiling softly as he disappeared into the dark. It was a Thursday morning when everything truly began to unravel, though Colton wouldn't realize it until much later. At first glance, it felt like any other day, routine, structured, meticulously organized the way he liked it. The scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the kitchen, sunlight poured in through the high glass panels, and the house staff moved quietly through their morning duties. Brielle was already awake, dressed in a fitted ivory robe, seated in the breakfast nook scrolling through her phone with a serene expression that didn't match the chaos quietly building around them. Her legs were crossed elegantly, one foot tapping a soft rhythm against the tile floor, the kind of unconscious movement that betrayed a mind not nearly as calm as the face it wore. Colton sat across from her with a growing weight in his chest. The walls of the mansion felt tighter than usual, the air heavier, and the silence between them longer. There were no fights, no arguments, nothing loud or theatrical. Just a thick, slow-growing awareness that something was slipping, something irreversible. The night before, he'd gone through their shared bank accounts again, and what he saw this time couldn't be brushed aside. Multiple large transfers had been made over the past 3 weeks. The recipients weren't vendors or contractors. They were offshore accounts, scattered across jurisdictions known for secrecy. Some had labels like consultation fees, others simply private allocation. He traced one account to a shell corporation that Nathaniel confirmed had been linked to a previous embezzlement case in Prague, one Brielle had never mentioned, though a woman under one of her former aliases had. He hadn't confronted her. Not yet. He wanted to gather everything first, tie up loose ends, assemble undeniable proof. But the more he dug, the more he realized that she had already outpaced him. And worse, she had access to everything. His systems, his passwords, even his signature. That morning, when he arrived at his office in the city, the building manager met him in the lobby with a strained expression. "Mr. Reeves," the man said, clearing his throat, "we've received notice that your lease is under review." "What notice?" Colton asked sharply. "The financial institution that handles your commercial holdings initiated a freeze. There's been activity flagged for investigation." Colton blinked. "What are you talking about? Who initiated the freeze?" "Federal authorities, sir. There's a preliminary audit order. We were just informed." Colton's chest tightened. He pushed past the manager, entered the elevator, and rode in silence to the top floor. When the doors opened, his staff was already in a flurry of activity, phones ringing non-stop, assistants scrambling between desks, hushed whispers echoing through the corridor. One of his partners pulled him aside. "You need to see this," he said, handing him a tablet. Colton stared at the headline blinking across the screen. "Financial misconduct allegations emerge in Reeves Holdings. Federal inquiry underway." Beneath it, a grainy image of a document, part of a digital transfer authorization bearing his signature, with amounts far larger than anything he had approved. The article speculated about internal fraud, offshore laundering, questionable ties between Reeves Holdings and anonymous shell accounts. The story was still developing, but the damage was already done. Colton's name was splashed across every financial news platform, each report casting shadows over his credibility. "I didn't authorize any of this," Colton muttered, eyes still fixed on the screen. "We know," his partner said, voice low, "but it's your signature. And your accounts. This is bad." Colton stormed into his office, slammed the door, and called Nathaniel. "How did this happen? How the hell did this get out?" Nathaniel's voice was grim. "You need to come in. Now." When Colton arrived at Nathaniel's private office, he was met with a stack of folders and a hollow look. "I've traced the transfers," Nathaniel said, "and there's no mistake. They originated from your accounts, your authorizations. But the digital fingerprints, they're falsified. Someone copied your signature and used biometric bypasses. It's high-level fraud. Colton sank into the chair. Can you prove it wasn't me? That's the problem, Nathaniel replied. The trail looks legitimate on the surface. But when you dig deeper, you see the inconsistencies. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. Colton rubbed his temples. You think it's her? Nathaniel nodded slowly. It's her. Or at least, she's involved. Colton stood suddenly, pacing the room. I need to get back to the house. You need to be careful, Nathaniel interrupted. This is bigger than just your money. If the authorities think you're complicit, you could be facing serious charges. Then I'll prove I'm not. Then you better start yesterday. That night, Colton returned home to find Brielle in the living room, a jazz playlist humming softly in the background, a glass of wine in her hand. She greeted him with a smile that looked almost rehearsed. You're home late. He didn't answer. He walked past her into his study, locking the door behind him. He turned on his laptop and opened a secure folder Nathaniel had sent him, a compilation of everything they'd uncovered. He stared at the files, each one a nail in the coffin of the life he thought he'd built. His reputation was already bleeding. The media would keep digging. His investors would retreat. And sooner or later, the government would knock on his door. The knock came sooner than expected. The next morning, 2 federal agents arrived with a warrant. They searched the house, requested access to his personal and corporate records, and confiscated several devices. Brielle watched the entire scene unfold from the staircase, arms crossed, expression unreadable. When Colton confronted her afterward, her demeanor shifted. What are you accusing me of? She asked, feigning shock. You know exactly what I'm accusing you of, he said through clenched teeth. I've done nothing, she replied coldly. And if you think dragging me through this mess will clear your name, you're delusional. Get out. You don't have the authority to throw me out of a house I helped build. You didn't build anything. You stole. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. Prove it. And then she turned and walked away, heels clicking against the floor like a gavel echoing through a courtroom. Colton stood alone in the hallway, fists clenched, chest heaving, watching the door close behind her. And somewhere deep inside him, beneath the anger, beneath the disbelief, he felt something colder, something sharper than rage. He felt fear. The media storm arrived like a tidal wave, unrelenting, indiscriminate, and louder than anything Colton had ever experienced. By mid-morning, his name was trending nationally. Not for a new business venture, not for a charitable donation, not even for a controversial quote. This time, it was for scandal. Headlines flashed across every major news outlet. Colton Reeves accused of financial fraud. Millionaire mogul under federal investigation. Offshore laundering tied to Reeves Holdings. News vans crowded the gates of his estate. Reporters shouted through the intercom system. Helicopters hovered overhead. Photographers camped outside the property, hoping for a glimpse of the man who had once been the city's most respected business figure, and who now stood at the center of a scandal that grew more complicated by the hour. Inside the house, Colton sat alone in his study, the curtains drawn, the television muted but playing continuous coverage of his downfall. The footage looped over and over again. Agents entering his home, boxes of seized documents being loaded into black SUVs, legal analysts speculating about prison sentences. His phone hadn't stopped vibrating. Calls from investors, from lawyers, from people he hadn't spoken to in years. Some wanted to offer support, others to distance themselves. Most just wanted information, but none of them knew the truth. Not even he knew the full extent of what had been done in his name, behind his back, using his own accounts. Brielle had disappeared. She was gone by sunrise. Her closet was nearly empty, her passport missing, her car abandoned at a nearby hotel. No note, no message, just a void where she used to be, as if she'd never existed at all. But she had left one thing behind, an envelope on the kitchen counter addressed to him, inside which was a single photograph. It was a candid shot, taken from a security camera, showing Colton seated in his study late one evening, reviewing files. The timestamp was 3 days before the first fraudulent transaction. Scrawled on the back in red ink were 5 words. You always miss the details. Nathaniel arrived hours later, unshaven and exhausted, carrying a briefcase full of bad news. They've frozen everything, he said. Personal, business, holdings, even your offshore assets that had nothing to do with her. It's all under review now. Colton rubbed his temples. How long before I'm arrested? We're trying to prevent that, Nathaniel said carefully. But the narrative isn't in your hands anymore. The media is building their own version of the story, and prosecutors are watching public reaction closely. Colton looked out the window. A reporter was pointing at the gate, animated and loud. Do they even care if I'm innocent? Not really, Nathaniel said. They care about headlines. In a desperate move, Colton arranged an emergency press conference. He stood behind a podium at the headquarters of his now crippled company, flanked by legal advisors, facing a sea of flashing cameras and unforgiving questions. He delivered a speech he hadn't prepared, a last-minute plea for the public to see reason. I have never knowingly participated in any fraudulent activity, he said. I have been misled, manipulated, and deceived. The person responsible is no longer in my life. I intend to cooperate fully with investigators to clear my name. But as he spoke, he could see the skepticism in their eyes. The reporters didn't want truth. They wanted scandal. They wanted blood. Back at the mansion, the house felt like a museum of broken dreams. The rooms were still furnished, the artwork still hung, the chandeliers still gleamed, but everything had changed. The silence was no longer peaceful, it was suffocating. Colton wandered through the halls like a ghost, stopping at random to glance at things that once meant something. A framed photo from a company gala, a vintage record player Dana had gifted him on their 10th anniversary, a leather-bound journal filled with business notes he used to value. He paused in the hallway outside the master suite, where a faint scent of Brielle's perfume still lingered in the air. It made his stomach twist. Later that night, Nathaniel returned with another development. I need to tell you something, he said, setting a stack of documents on the table. It's about Dana. Colton frowned. What about her? She's been in contact with the investigators. Colton's face darkened. What? She submitted a statement voluntarily. Apparently, she's been watching all this unfold from a distance, but she finally decided to step in. Colton stood abruptly. She thinks I'm guilty? I don't think that's her angle, Nathaniel replied. From what I understand, she has information that could shift the case. She's offering a timeline of your business practices before Brielle entered the picture, highlighting patterns that prove your history of transparency and consistency. Colton didn't know whether to feel grateful or humiliated. Dana, the woman he'd cast aside, was now defending him to the authorities. He didn't deserve it. He knew that. But part of him also knew she was probably his last chance. The following day, Dana called him for the first time in months. I'm not doing this for you, she said, voice cool and steady. I'm doing this because I refuse to let a liar ruin what I helped build. I know, he said softly. You were reckless, Colton. You wanted a fantasy, and you got it. But you dragged our name through the mud in the process. I didn't know who she really was. No, but you didn't care either. You just liked how she made you feel. And now the rest of us are left to clean it up. He had no defense. Nothing he could say would undo the past. He thanked her quietly, and she hung up without another word. The next days moved in a blur. The authorities continued their investigation, and slowly, pieces began to fall into place. Brielle had used multiple identities to infiltrate high-net-worth individuals, executing financial extractions through layered transactions. She wasn't acting alone. There was a network behind her, an organization known for targeting wealthy men through personal relationships. Colton had been their latest prize. The media began to shift slightly, reporting more on the criminal enterprise and less on Colton's guilt. But the damage was irreversible. His business empire had crumbled, his accounts stripped, his reputation scarred. The name Reeves no longer meant prestige, it meant scandal. One afternoon, while cleaning out his study, he found a letter tucked inside a desk drawer, handwritten, folded carefully. It wasn't from Brielle. It was from Dana, dated several months before the divorce. He opened it with trembling hands. I knew you were drifting, it read. I felt it long before you ever said a word. You wanted something different, something shiny. And I realized, eventually, that I couldn't compete with the idea of youth or excitement. But I want you to remember one thing. I stood beside you not because I needed your money or your name. I stood beside you because I believed in who you were before you forgot yourself. He folded the letter and held it for a long time. Outside, the cameras were finally gone. The media had moved on to fresher scandals. But the house remained. The silence remained. And Colton, stripped of everything he once thought defined him, sat in that silence and wondered what would come next. The wind had shifted. Not outside, where the breeze rustled through the manicured hedges of the Reeves estate, but inside Colton himself. He felt it. Something turning, something undeniable. It was as if the glamour of his previous life had evaporated entirely, leaving behind only the sharp outlines of reality. His name, once respected in every boardroom and dinner party across the city, now stirred conversations filled with raised eyebrows and hushed tones. The mansion, though still pristine in its structure, had become a hollow monument to his misplaced trust and the illusion he'd once called freedom. The scandal had already carved deep wounds in his business and public image, but something deeper still gnawed at him. Something unresolved. Something that wouldn't stop whispering that the worst part of this mess was still hiding somewhere in the shadows. Then came the call that would change everything. Nathaniel's voice on the other end was tense, urgent, almost unlike him. "You need to come to my office. Now. It's about Brielle." Colton arrived within the hour, heart pounding, uncertainty tightening his throat. Nathaniel didn't waste time with pleasantries. He motioned for Colton to sit and slid a thick file across the desk toward him. "These are documents recovered from one of her abandoned storage units," Nathaniel said. "The authorities contacted me this morning. They verified her fingerprints on every item. But this," he tapped the folder, "this is what finally completes the puzzle." Colton opened it with slow, shaking hands. Inside were a series of forged identities, complete with photos, fake IDs, passports, tax forms, and even social media profiles, each created and cultivated to support an alias. Every few pages, the name changed, but the face remained the same. Brielle, sometimes as Alessia, sometimes as Raquel, sometimes even under a gender-neutral alias to open untraceable accounts. Her life was like a mosaic of carefully crafted lies, each version seamlessly blending into the next. She had been several people before she became Brielle. Each identity had a pattern: infiltration, manipulation, extraction, disappearance. Wealthy men, all high profile, some married, some divorced, all blinded by charm and fantasy. Colton saw their faces, victims who looked eerily like him, older, powerful, successful. All of them lured into her web and left hollow once she vanished. One photograph struck him hardest. It was a candid shot, one taken at a gala several years before he'd even met Brielle. She was there, dressed in a different style, laughing on the arm of a man whose face was now redacted in the file. But it wasn't just the image, it was the way she looked in it. Not as a guest or a date, but like someone studying her surroundings. Watching, calculating. "Jesus," Colton whispered, flipping through more images. "There's more," Nathaniel said. "The financial documents show she wasn't working alone. We've traced transactions to at least 3 other individuals, including that man Liam who came to your home. And the other one, Cyrus, he's a known associate of a European syndicate specializing in high-net-worth scams. She was their entry point. You were never the goal. Your company was. Your assets. Your access." Colton leaned back, hands over his face. "I let her in. I gave her everything." Nathaniel nodded grimly. That was the plan all along. The silence that followed was deafening. Colton sat there, his mind spinning through every moment he'd shared with Brielle. Every kiss, every laugh, every tender conversation. It was all an act. A performance. She had never loved him. She had studied him, profiled him, peeled back the layers of his life until she knew exactly where to strike. His downfall hadn't been accidental. It had been orchestrated from the moment she walked into his world. As if to further twist the knife, Nathaniel reached for another document. "You should see this." It was a copy of a business registration certificate, an offshore company established just 2 months before Brielle moved into his home. The registered owner? Colton Reeves. But his signature had been forged. The company had been used to funnel funds, launder assets, and create a trail that would eventually circle back to him if no one ever caught it. It was genius, diabolical, devastating. "She made you the fall guy," Nathaniel said quietly, "and it would have worked. If Dana hadn't stepped in, if we hadn't started connecting the dots, you would have ended up behind bars. Everything was designed to make you look like the mastermind while she disappeared clean." Colton's hands trembled. "And the authorities? They're shifting focus. She's now officially listed as a suspect in a multinational financial crime ring. You'll likely face scrutiny for a while, but if we keep cooperating, you may avoid prosecution. That said, your reputation is another matter." Colton closed the folder slowly. "I deserve that much, at least." When he returned home, the mansion felt even more cavernous. The shadows seemed longer, the walls colder. He stood in the center of the grand foyer and looked around, realizing that everything he once thought was beautiful now felt staged, tainted. Even the art on the walls seemed to mock him. He walked slowly into the bedroom that had once belonged to him and Brielle, now emptied of her things but still haunted by her scent, her voice, her touch. He opened the dresser drawer and found a velvet pouch tucked in the back corner. Inside was a gold bracelet he'd gifted her, a custom piece engraved with his initials. Next to it was a note written in her delicate, elegant handwriting. "Don't take it personally. You were just part of the game." He dropped the bracelet onto the nightstand and stared at the note, fingers tightening around the paper until it crumpled in his palm. Days passed in a blur. Investigators continued gathering evidence. Lawyers crafted statements. The media reported more details about Brielle's network, highlighting other victims who now came forward, ashamed but relieved to learn they weren't alone. Public opinion began to sway. Sympathy trickled in, but it was too late to undo the damage. Then one morning, Colton received an envelope from Dana. Inside was a printed copy of a magazine article featuring her on the cover, the woman who turned scandal into strength. The interview detailed how she rebuilt her life post-divorce, how she was now mentoring women entrepreneurs, and how she'd helped authorities uncover a criminal ring by following her own instincts about her ex-husband's mysterious new partner. She had not named him publicly, preserving his privacy even now. Attached was a short note, handwritten. "You may have lost everything, but you didn't lose yourself entirely. That's something." Colton read the note twice, then folded it and placed it inside the journal Dana had once given him, the one he'd ignored for years. Later that evening, standing alone on the terrace as the sky turned indigo, he poured himself a glass of scotch and stared at the city lights below. He wondered where Brielle was now, what identity she'd taken, what city she'd disappeared into, what man she was already studying. But mostly, he wondered how long it would take for him to stop seeing her in every corner of his house, every reflection in his glass, every lie he told himself. The fantasy was over. The secrets were out, and all that remained was the silence of truth. Colton sat quietly in the corner booth of a dimly lit restaurant, a place he used to frequent with clients before his world had begun collapsing. The air smelled of aged wood and old conversations, the kind of space that once made him feel important, untouchable, a man who owned his narrative and shaped his destiny. Now, he was just another face in a room full of whispers, a former icon carrying the heavy burden of public shame. He had come to this place hoping for clarity, perhaps some distant echo of the life he had lost, but all he found was a deeper awareness of how far he had fallen. He no longer commanded rooms. People no longer leaned in when he spoke. His presence no longer sparked admiration, it sparked discomfort. He felt it in the way the hostess avoided eye contact, in the hesitant smile of the server who clearly recognized him but said nothing. His name didn't need to be spoken. It had already become a cautionary tale. Nathaniel joined him minutes later, dropping a thick folder on the table without ceremony. "They want to make an example out of you," he said grimly. "Even with the evidence we've presented, even with the shift in narrative, they want to see you punished in some way. Publicly. They don't care about justice. They care about headlines." Colton leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "What are the options?" "Settlement with conditions," Nathaniel replied. "They'll drop the most serious charges in exchange for cooperation and restitution. But they'll want you to surrender the rest of your business holdings, and you'll be barred from holding executive positions for a minimum of 10 years. Financially, you'll be left with enough to live modestly, but nothing close to what you had. And if I refuse, then they push for full prosecution. You could face prison time. Maybe not years, but enough to ruin any hope of rebuilding." Colton sat back in silence. For a man who once had everything, the options now seemed almost comically cruel. There was no winning, just different shades of losing. He thought of the empire he had spent decades building, the sleepless nights, the negotiations, the sacrifices. All of it reduced to a file folder and a list of consequences. Then Nathaniel pulled out another envelope. "Dana sent this," he said quietly. Colton opened it slowly. Inside was a formal letter, an offer. She proposed a way out, a plan she had discussed with legal advisors and submitted to the court through her own attorney. She would testify in Colton's favor, confirming that his business practices before Brielle's arrival were ethical and consistent. Her statement would carry significant weight. In return, she asked for one thing: full transfer of Colton's remaining shares into a charitable trust in their daughter's name. The trust would fund educational programs for underserved communities, managed by a third-party board. It wasn't just a financial gesture. It was symbolic. A final correction. A legacy not built on scandal, but redemption. "She's offering to clear your name," Nathaniel said softly. "But you'll have to let go of everything else." Colton stared at the paper, his throat tightening. Why is she doing this? Maybe because she still believes there's something in you worth salvaging. He said nothing for a long time. He read the letter again, this time slower, as if trying to absorb every word. It was written with a tone he couldn't place. Not pity, not bitterness, but something sharper, colder, more dignified. Dana wasn't trying to rescue him. She was giving him a final chance to leave behind something that mattered, something that wouldn't be remembered for betrayal or scandal. That night, Colton walked through the mansion, each room echoing with memories he no longer wanted. He stood in the office where he once signed million-dollar deals, now filled with dust and forgotten papers. He lingered in the kitchen where Brielle used to smile, while preparing charcuterie boards for guests who would later laugh at his downfall. He stopped in the hallway where a photograph of him and Dana once hung, now replaced with an empty frame he hadn't noticed until now. He thought about what it meant to lose everything, and what it meant to accept that loss. Not as punishment, but as closure. The next morning, he signed the documents. The hearing took place 2 weeks later. The courtroom was quiet, somber, filled with a few journalists and curious onlookers. Dana sat in the witness box, composed and articulate, presenting her testimony with clarity and conviction. She outlined the timeline of Colton's career, the ethical protocols he had followed, the diligence he once upheld. She did not sugarcoat their personal history, nor did she defend his ego or choices. But she made it clear that the man he had become under Brielle's manipulation was not the man she once knew. When it was Colton's turn to speak, he stood slowly, facing the judge with a heavy heart. "I was foolish," he said, voice steady. "I let pride blind me. I believed in something because I wanted to, not because it made sense. And that belief cost me everything. But I accept that. I accept the consequences of my inaction. I only ask that the legacy I leave behind not be one of deceit, but one of correction." The judge nodded slowly. The agreement was accepted. Charges were reduced. The transfer to the charitable trust was formalized. The courtroom emptied quietly, without applause, without headlines screaming victory. Just closure. Outside, the sky was overcast, and Colton stepped onto the courthouse steps alone. Dana passed him briefly, offering a small nod as she walked toward her car. He called out to her, "Why did you help me?" She paused for a moment before turning to him. "Because I didn't want our daughter to grow up thinking her father was a coward." He nodded, emotion swelling in his chest. "And because I knew this would hurt you more than prison ever could," she added, not unkindly, then turned away. That night, Colton returned to the mansion for the last time. The furniture was already being moved out, the art packed, the rooms stripped bare. He stood in the middle of the foyer, the same place he had once stood so confidently beside Brielle, and listened to the echoes of his own footsteps. The house was no longer his. The empire was no longer his. But strangely, for the first time in months, his mind felt quiet. Not at peace, perhaps, but still. He walked through each room, saying goodbye not just to a house, but to a version of himself that no longer existed. He took nothing with him except a single photograph from the study, one of Dana and their daughter on a beach years ago, laughing beneath the sun. He placed it in the passenger seat of his car and drove away with nothing but the hum of the engine and the realization that sometimes the only way forward is through complete surrender. The apartment was small, modest, and nearly bare, a far cry from the towering estate Colton had once called home. The walls were plain, the furniture minimal, and the hum of traffic from the street below seeped in through thin windows that offered no insulation from the sounds of everyday life. It was the kind of place he wouldn't have even considered visiting in his former life, much less living in. But now it was all he had. A clean slate, stripped of wealth, stripped of power, stripped of illusions. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the chipped corner of the nightstand, fingers rubbing absently at the scar on his left knuckle, a small injury from the past few weeks, caused not by some great event, but by trying to fix a loose hinge on the door himself. There were no staff here to fix things, no assistants to schedule repairs, no chefs to prepare meals. Just Colton, alone with his thoughts and the sound of his own breathing. He had chosen this, in a way. He could have fought harder to keep fragments of his empire, could have buried the truth beneath legal strategy and media manipulation. But that would have been yet another performance, another illusion, and he no longer had the stomach for lies. The price of keeping up appearances had cost him everything that once made him feel whole, and now that the dust had settled, he was left to face the person behind the mask, the man who had traded loyalty for lust, partnership for pride, reality for fantasy. There was no mansion to distract him, no luxury car to drown the silence. Just him, stripped bare. He found a routine in simplicity. Morning walks to the local coffee shop where no one recognized him. Afternoons spent volunteering at a community center where he filed papers and swept floors, and evenings reading books he had never had time to finish. It was monotonous, unglamorous, but real. There was no applause here, no validation. And strangely, that brought a kind of peace he hadn't felt in years. The detachment from wealth forced him to examine every thought, every decision, every step that had brought him to this point. Sometimes he wondered where Brielle was. He imagined her slipping into a new city, a new name, a new identity, starting the cycle all over again. Maybe she had already found her next target, a lonely executive with a fragile ego and too much money to notice the cracks in her story. He no longer felt anger when he thought of her, not even hatred. Just a quiet ache, like the soreness left behind after a long illness. She had been the storm, but he had been the door left open. The mistake wasn't just trusting her. It was failing to trust his own instincts, ignoring the voice inside that had warned him when it still mattered. One afternoon, as he walked through a park near the edge of town, he noticed a familiar figure sitting on a bench beneath a maple tree. Dana. She was dressed in a simple blouse and jeans, hair tied back in a loose knot, a book open in her lap. She hadn't seen him yet. He hesitated, unsure if he should approach. Part of him felt like an intruder in her life, a chapter she had already closed. But then she looked up and saw him, and her expression didn't harden or falter. She simply smiled, gently, like she'd been expecting him all along. He walked over slowly, unsure what to say. She patted the bench beside her. He sat down, and for a moment, they said nothing. Just listened to the rustling leaves, the laughter of children playing nearby, the rhythm of a world that had kept turning while they had both fallen apart. I read the article, he said finally. The one about your foundation. She nodded. It's going well. We've helped over 200 kids enroll in mentorship programs this year. I'm glad, he said. You always knew how to build something meaningful. I just got tired of building for everyone else, she replied. They sat in silence again. He turned to her, hesitating before speaking. Thank you, Dana. For everything. For speaking up. For giving me a way out. I didn't do it for you, she said, not unkindly. I did it because I knew you weren't a criminal. Just a fool. He laughed softly. Fair enough. She looked at him then, really looked at him, as if searching for something beneath the surface. You're different now, she said. Quieter. I've lost everything. Maybe. Or maybe you just lost what you thought you needed. He nodded slowly. He didn't expect forgiveness, not entirely. But her words felt like a small mercy, a crack of sunlight through a long winter. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, she stood. Take care of yourself, Colton. You too. She walked away, and he watched her disappear down the path, feeling a bittersweet swell in his chest. It wasn't a reconciliation, not really. But it was something. Later that night, back in his apartment, he pulled out the old journal Dana had once given him, the one he had ignored for so many years. He opened it to a blank page and began to write. Not a business plan, not an agenda, just thoughts, raw and honest. Reflections, regrets, lessons. He wrote about the difference between love and illusion, about the quiet strength of dignity, about the price of arrogance. He wrote about the emptiness of wealth without purpose and the slow death that comes from chasing validation. He didn't write to be read. He wrote to remember. Somewhere outside, the city continued moving, unbothered by the story of a fallen millionaire. People hurried past windows, taxis honked, neon lights flickered. But in that quiet room, Colton Reeves reclaimed something more valuable than money: awareness, clarity, perhaps even redemption. He knew the world wouldn't welcome him back with open arms. He knew his name would always carry a shadow. But he also knew that shadows didn't exist without light. And maybe, just maybe, he still had time to find some.